May 7, 1945. Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The air smelled of diesel fuel and burnt rubber. Captain Robert Brennan stood in the cobblestone plaza of a city that had just stopped being German and hadn't yet decided what it was becoming. Buildings wore the scars of 4 days of street fighting, windows shattered into geometric patterns, walls pockmarked by small arms fire. American tanks from the 16th Armored Division sat at every intersection, engines idling, crews watching the crowds with the cautious alertness of men who knew liberation could turn ugly without warning. Brennan was 31 years old, a former high school history teacher from Vermont who had spent 3 years learning that the war he read about in books bore little resemblance to the one he was living. He commanded easy company, and his orders for the day were simple enough on paper. Maintain order in Sector 4, prevent looting, keep civilians away from military installations. The reality was considerably more complex. A Czech interpreter named Karel Dvorak appeared at his elbow, breathing hard from running. The man was 50-something, gray-haired, wearing a suit that had been expensive before the war and now hung loose on a frame that hunger had whittled down. He spoke English with a British accent acquired at Cambridge before 1938 made degrees irrelevant. "Captain, you need to come now. There is a situation developing at the town hall. A crowd has gathered and they have someone they say collaborated with the Germans." Brennan felt his stomach tighten. He had seen this before in France, in Belgium, in Western Germany. The pattern was always the same. Liberation brought joy for approximately 6 hours, then came the reckoning. Old scores settled, accusations flying, evidence optional. Sometimes the accused were guilty of genuine crimes. Sometimes they were guilty of nothing more than being visible while others suffered in secret. The problem was telling the difference in the moment when the crowd was already forming and someone was tying the rope. "Show me," Brennan said. They walked quickly through streets where civilians were emerging from basements and cellars, blinking in the daylight, carrying bundles of possessions, calling for missing family members. The mood was strange, celebratory and tense in equal measure. People cheered when they saw American uniforms, but there was something hungry in their eyes, something that had nothing to do with food. The town hall was a Baroque building that had survived the fighting intact. A crowd of maybe 200 people filled the square in front of it. Brennan could hear them from a block away, not quite shouting but not quite talking either. A low rumble of collective anger seeking an outlet. When they reached the edge of the crowd, Dvorak pushed through, calling out in Czech. People turned, recognized the American uniform, and parted grudgingly. Brennan followed in his wake, aware of the eyes tracking him, judging whether he would help or hinder what they had planned. At the center of the crowd, 3 men held a fourth. The prisoner was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in the remnants of what had once been a decent suit. His face was already bruised, blood trickling from a split lip. His hands were bound behind his back with electrical wire. The 3 men holding him were younger, harder-faced, wearing armbands that Brennan recognized from the Czech resistance movement. A 5th man stood on the town hall steps, addressing the crowd. He was tall, well-dressed despite the circumstances, speaking with the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking. Dvorak leaned close to translate. "He says the prisoner is Eduard Novak, the former deputy mayor under the German occupation. He says Novak collaborated with the Gestapo, provided them with lists of resistance members, helped them identify Jews for deportation. He says Novak is responsible for at least 37 deaths." The crowd responded with a roar of approval. Someone threw a stone that struck Novak in the shoulder. He flinched but did not cry out. Brennan studied the scene with the detachment that came from seeing too many variations of the same tableau. The speaker on the steps was too well-fed to have suffered much during the occupation. His suit was newer than Dvorak's, his shoes unscuffed. The resistance fighters holding Novak looked genuine enough, thin and scarred and carrying themselves with the hunted alertness of men who had lived in the shadows. The crowd was a mix, some genuinely angry, others simply caught up in the moment, still others watching with the careful neutrality of people waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing themselves. "Tell him I need to speak with him," Brennan said, indicating the speaker on the steps. Dvorak called out. The speaker turned, and his expression shifted instantly from righteous anger to calculated courtesy. He came down the steps and extended his hand to Brennan. "Dar. Joseph Ruska," he said in accented but fluent English. "I apologize that we meet under such circumstances, Captain. We are simply trying to ensure that justice is done for those who cannot speak for themselves any longer." Brennan did not take the offered hand. "What evidence do you have against this man?" Ruska's smile thinned slightly. "Evidence? Captain, this man served the Germans faithfully for 6 years. Everyone in this city knows what he did. He signed the orders that sent people to their deaths. Did you see him sign these orders? Did you witness him collaborating with the Gestapo? Can you produce documents, testimony from multiple independent witnesses, anything beyond the word of an angry crowd?" Ruska's expression hardened. "Captain, I understand you are new to this country, but we have lived under occupation while you were safe across the ocean. We know who betrayed us. We know who profited while others starved. We know who smiled at German officers while Czech patriots died in cellars. Knowing and proving are different things, Dr. Ruska. I'm not questioning your sincerity, but I am questioning your methodology. This man deserves a trial, proper legal proceedings, not summary judgment in a town square." The crowd was pressing closer now, sensing opposition, growing restless. Ruska raised his voice so they could hear. "The captain suggests we should give this traitor a trial, as if he gave trials to the people he sent to the camps, as if the Germans he served gave trials to the children they murdered." The crowd responded with shouts of agreement. Brennan felt the situation tilting toward violence. He had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would either restore order or start a riot that would leave people dead, possibly including American soldiers, definitely including the man tied with electrical wire. He turned to Dvorak. "Tell them exactly what I say, word for word." Dvorak nodded. Brennan raised his voice, projecting the way he had learned to project during officer training at Fort Benning when instructors demanded you command a parade ground without shouting. "I understand your anger. I understand your desire for justice. But I cannot allow an execution without due process, not in a sector under American military authority. This man will be held in custody, he will be formally charged, evidence will be gathered, and he will face trial. If he is guilty, he will be punished according to law. But I will not permit a lynching, no matter how justified you believe it to be." Dvorak translated in rapid Czech. The crowd's rumble grew louder, more hostile. Someone shouted something that Dvorak did not translate, but the tone needed no translation. Ruska stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Brennan could hear. "Captain, you are making a mistake. These people need to see justice done immediately. They need to know that their suffering mattered, that there are consequences for collaboration. If you take this man into custody, you will be protecting a traitor and turning the people of this city against the Americans who just liberated them." "If I allow this man to be killed by a mob," Brennan said quietly, "I will be complicit in murder, and I will have failed the principles that brought me to this continent in the first place. I didn't cross an ocean to watch civilians execute each other in town squares. You crossed an ocean to defeat fascism," Ruska said. "This man served fascism. What is the difference between him dying now and him dying in a legal proceeding 3 months from now? The outcome is the same. The difference is whether we are better than what we defeated. The difference is whether we believe in law or whether we believe in revenge. Those are not the same thing, Dr. Ruska, no matter how much you want them to be." Brennan turned away from Ruska and addressed the resistance fighters holding Novak. "Release him to American custody." The 3 men looked at each other, uncertain. One of them spoke rapidly in Czech. Dvorak translated. "He says they answer to the Czech Resistance Command, not to the American Army. He says this is Czech justice for Czech crimes. I respect that sentiment, Brennan said, but this city is currently under American military governance as per the agreements made between the Allied powers. Until a legitimate Czech government is established, criminal proceedings are subject to American oversight. This man will receive a fair trial, I give you my word. But he will not be executed here today. The resistance fighter who had spoken stepped forward. He was perhaps 25, with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. When he spoke, his voice was level but cold. Dvorak translated. My family is dead because of men like him. My sister was 16 when they took her. Men like him made the lists. Men like him smiled and nodded and made it possible. You want me to wait for justice? I have been waiting for 6 years. Brennan met his eyes and did not look away. I am sorry for what happened to your family. I have seen too many empty rooms and unanswered questions myself. But killing this man without trial will not bring your sister back, and it will not make you into something better than what killed her. It will just make you another kind of murderer. The young man's hand moved toward the pistol tucked in his belt. For a moment that stretched like pulled wire, Brennan thought he would have to draw his own sidearm, thought the situation would collapse into gunfire and bodies and everything terrible that could follow. Then the young man's hand fell away from the pistol. He said something short and bitter, turned, and walked away through the crowd. The other two resistance fighters looked at each other, at Ruska, at the crowd, then released Novak and stepped back. The crowd erupted in shouts of protest. Brennan gestured sharply to Sergeant Miller, who had been standing at the edge of the square with a squad of infantry. Miller, take this man into custody. Put him in the holding cells at headquarters. No visitors without my authorization. Miller moved forward with 4 soldiers. They took Novak by the arms and began walking him toward the military vehicles parked 2 blocks away. The crowd surged forward, and for a terrible second Brennan thought they would rush the soldiers, thought he would have to give the order to fix bayonets, thought the liberation of Pilsen would end with Americans shooting Czechs in the street. Instead, Ruska raised both hands and spoke rapidly. The crowd hesitated, muttering but not advancing. Brennan used the moment to walk after Miller, positioning himself between the soldiers escorting Novak and the angry civilians. They reached the vehicles without incident. Novak was placed in the back of a truck, 2 guards with him, Miller riding in front. The truck pulled away, engine grinding through gears. Brennan stood in the street and watched it go, acutely aware that he had just made enemies in a city where he would be responsible for maintaining order for the foreseeable future. He wondered if he had done the right thing. He wondered if Novak was guilty. He wondered if there was any version of right thing that could exist in a situation so thoroughly poisoned by years of occupation and collaboration and betrayal. Dvorak appeared beside him, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. That was either very brave or very foolish, Captain. I honestly don't know which. Ruska will make trouble for you. He has influence with the provisional government, connections with the resistance leadership. You have made an enemy today. Then I'll deal with an enemy, Brennan said. I've dealt with worse. Over the following 3 weeks, Brennan learned exactly how difficult dealing with Dr. Joseph Ruska could be. Complaints were filed with division headquarters. Newspaper articles appeared questioning whether American forces understood the realities of occupation and collaboration. Czech officials politely but persistently requested that Novak be transferred to Czech custody for trial. Throughout it all, Brennan insisted on proper procedure. He assigned a military investigator, Lieutenant William Foster, to examine the evidence against Novak. Foster interviewed witnesses, reviewed documents, cross-referenced testimony. What he found was complex and troubling. Novak had indeed served as deputy mayor under the German occupation, appointed to the position by the German military administration in 1939. He had signed administrative documents, attended official functions, maintained civil services under German supervision. But the evidence linking him to specific atrocities was thin and contradictory. 3 witnesses claimed to have seen Novak provide lists to the Gestapo. 4 others, including 2 former resistance members, stated that Novak had actually helped hide people, that he had delayed deportation orders, that he had used his position to sabotage German efficiency from within. One elderly woman swore that Novak had warned her family the night before a Gestapo raid, giving them time to flee. The truth, Foster concluded in his report, was likely somewhere between villain and hero. Novak had been a bureaucrat trying to survive impossible circumstances, sometimes complicit, sometimes resistant, always calculating the odds of his own survival against the potential to help others. Not a war criminal, Foster wrote, but not exactly innocent either. A man who made compromises that kept him alive while others died making different choices. Brennan read the report twice, then a third time. He thought about the young resistance fighter with the scar, about his dead sister, about whether partial complicity deserved the same punishment as enthusiastic collaboration. He thought about whether justice could account for the impossible arithmetic of occupation, where doing nothing was itself a form of action, and where survival sometimes required moral compromises that looked indistinguishable from betrayal. On June 3, 1945, Brennan attended the formal trial of Eduard Novak, held in the main courthouse of Pilsen under joint American and Czech authority. The courtroom was packed with observers, journalists, survivors, accusers. Dr. Ruska sat in the front row, watching with cold attention. The trial lasted 4 days. Witnesses testified to Novak's actions and inactions. Documents were examined. Novak himself spoke for 3 hours, describing the impossible choices of occupation, the calculations he made, the people he tried to help, the failures that still haunted him. The verdict, delivered by a panel of 3 judges, 2 Czech and 1 American, was guilty of collaboration but with mitigating circumstances. The sentence was 12 years imprisonment, subject to review after 5 years based on good behavior. The crowd in the courtroom received the verdict in hostile silence. As Novak was led away, someone spat at him. Someone else shouted traitor. The young resistance fighter with the scar stood and left without speaking. Outside the courthouse, Dr. Ruska approached Brennan with an expression of restrained fury. "You should be proud, Captain. You have ensured that a man who served the Germans will eventually walk free, while the people he helped kill remain dead." "I ensured that a man received a trial according to law," Brennan replied. "Whether you approve of the outcome is irrelevant to whether the process was just. Justice," Ruska said bitterly, "is what the winners decide it is. Today the winners decided to protect a collaborator because it made them feel civilized. The winners," Brennan said, "decided not to become the thing they fought against. That's not protection, Dr. Ruska, that's principle." Ruska walked away without responding. Brennan watched him go and felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just exhaustion and the lingering question of whether he had been right. 3 months later, Brennan was reassigned to occupation duties in Germany. He never saw Pilsen again, never learned what happened to Eduard Novak after his imprisonment, never found out if the young resistance fighter found peace or remained haunted by his sister's absence. But he remembered standing in that town square, watching a crowd prepare to kill a man, knowing that he could either stop it or walk away. He remembered choosing to stop it, not because he knew Novak was innocent, but because he knew the crowd was wrong. He remembered that the hardest moments of the war were not the ones where he faced enemies with weapons, but the ones where he faced allies demanding he abandon the principles that made the war worth fighting. In the final accounting, the liberation of Europe was not a single moment but 1,000 moments, each requiring someone to choose between expedience and conscience, between what was easy and what was right. Sometimes those choices saved lives. Sometimes they merely delayed injustice rather than preventing it. But always they defined what kind of world would emerge from the ashes of the one that had been destroyed. Robert Brennan returned to Vermont in November 1945. He resumed teaching history at the same high school where he had worked before the war. He rarely spoke about his service, rarely mentioned Pilsen or Eduard Novak or the crowd in the town square. But on the day each year when he taught about World War II, he would pause after discussing the military campaigns and the political outcomes, and he would tell his students one thing. The war was not won just by the soldiers who stormed beaches or the pilots who flew missions. It was won by everyone who, in moments of chaos and anger and pain, chose to remember that being human meant something more than survival. It meant holding on to principles even when those principles were inconvenient. It meant seeing another person and refusing to look away, even when looking away would have been easier. That was the war I fought, he would say. Not the one in the history books, but the one that happened in the spaces between the documented battles, in the town squares and courtyards and rubble-strewn streets where ordinary people made impossible choices about who they would be when the world stopped making sense. Eduard Novak served 8 years of his 12-year sentence before being released in 1953. He lived quietly in Prague until his death in 1971. His obituary mentioned his wartime service in 2 sentences, neither condemning nor exonerating him, simply noting that he had been a deputy mayor during the occupation and had served time for collaboration. The complexity of what that meant remained unwritten. Dr. Josef Ruska became a prominent politician in post-war Czechoslovakia until the communist takeover in 1948, after which he fled to London and spent the rest of his life writing memoirs about the resistance. He never mentioned Robert Brennan or Eduard Novak in his published works. The young resistance fighter with the scar was never identified in official records. There were too many men who fit that description, too many scarred survivors who carried their losses in silence. If this story touched you, it's because the questions it raises are never fully answered. War doesn't end when the ceasefire is lifted. Sometimes the hardest wars are fought after liberation, when victims and survivors have to decide what justice means in a world that has forgotten how justice should be served. If you believe that putting conscience before complacency is important, even decades later, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share our story with your loved ones. Thank you for listening.